Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 510. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We are still holding our end of the year fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute, so head on over and make a donation while we have matching funds. We produce so much great content at the Libertarian Institute. We have a couple of really cool projects that are right in the phases of being released or will be released in the coming weeks, including Tom Woods' new book on the COVID hysteria, a great new book from James Bovard, and one from our friend Keith Knight. So lots of great books coming out at the Institute. And of course, we have daily content there too. Lots of podcasts, Scott Horton's show, this show, Conflicts of Interest. Keith Knight, Patrick McFarlane, and Tommy Solomons all also host podcasts for the Institute. I write in the news section of the Institute almost every day of the week. A couple of stories, usually ones I talk about on this show, and put together the daily news roundup. But that's not enough for you. We have featured articles, op-eds on everything dealing with libertarianism, from violating our rights at home to the empire overseas. So head on over to the Institute, make a donation, help us out. We really appreciate it. And if you can't, just, share out the show or recommend other people donate to the Institute. I know times are tough from some people, so just help out in any way you can. We really appreciate it. And let's get into the news today. I will say, probably for the first time in a couple weeks, it feels like I have a more normal and manageable amount of news. I don't think today's show will be an hour like some of the others earlier in the week. First up here today, U.S. military conducting flight operations in Guyana amid Venezuelan tensions. So, war in South America next is maybe the big question here. The U.S. military on Thursday said it would conduct surveillance or flights over Guyana amid tensions between the Caribbean nation and its neighbor Venezuela over a disputed region. The oil-rich region makes up about 2/3 of the territory of the state of Guyana, which ginned up which gained independence from Britain in 1966. In 1899, an American British tribunal ruled that the territory belonged to the UK, a position that was rejected by Venezuela. Venezuela, the UK, and then British Guyana reached a new agreement in 1966, known as the Geneva Agreement, to mutually satisfactory solution to the dispute. The International Court of Justice opened a case into the dispute in 2018, but a decision is still expected to be years away. Tensions have risen in recent years over the dispute as more oil discoveries in Guyana in the disputed territory continue to be made. The American energy giant ExxonMobil discovered massive oil reserves off the coast of Guyana in waters claimed by Venezuela, and it has been involved in a major offshore drilling project. The dispute escalated this week as Venezuelans voted to create a new state in Guyana in a referendum that was held on Sunday. Venezuelan President Maduro has since ordered the creation of the state, raising fears of a potential military action, although the two sides have agreed to keep talking on the issue. The U.S. is backing Guyana in the dispute, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken reaffirmed in a phone call with Guyana's president on Wednesday. According to the State Department, Blinken said the two sides should respect the 1899 ruling unless or until the parties reach a new agreement or a competent legal body decides otherwise. According to the U.S. Embassy in Guyana, U.S. Central Command planned to conduct flights with the Guyanese military on Thursday. This exercise builds upon engagement in operations to enhance the security partnership between the U.S. and Guyana to strengthen regional cooperation, the embassy said. The U.S. also attempted to overthrow the Venezuelan government in 2019 by backing a failed coup by self-proclaimed President Juan Guaido against Maduro and imposing crippling economic sanctions on the country. The Biden administration recently eased some sanctions, but is threatening to reimpose them. So, this does seem to be, to some extent, a legacy of colonialism in the Americas, that, this is something that was enforced by the British initially and decades later is now causing and creating these tensions. Of course, it would be horrible if Venezuela started a war for this region. I'm not sure how many people live there, how the people of there feel about it. And I guess it's good that the US says they're still open to some kind of international body, forming some kind of ruling here that can maybe satisfy both parties and lead to some kind of solution where there isn't a war and Venezuela doesn't feel like, they've lost a portion of their country because of colonialism. So we'll see how this development develops. I'll try to keep an eye on what the Venezuelan government is saying, how aggressive they seem to be willing to pursue this territory, and how serious they are about it. This is, from my understanding, a relatively I haven't heard about this discussed in Venezuelan politics in the past, so I will need to do some more research to get a better understanding of how serious Venezuela is here about this, and how far the U.S. would go to back Guyana, potentially going to war. All right, so next up here, some news on the situation in Ukraine. Senate Republicans block $111 billion military aid bill over borders dispute. So Senate Republicans blocked a motion to advance a massive $111 billion spending package that includes military aid for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, over a partisan dispute on the border issue. So remember, right after the October 7th Hamas attack, the Biden administration decided, it was at the time trying to pass a bill that I think had like 20 something billion dollars for Ukraine in it. And they were kicking around this idea of, we really want to have a bill that gives Ukraine enough aid to take Ukraine through the 2024 election in the US. So, they don't want it to become a big election issue, I guess. And so they came up with this 105 or $106 billion bill that has now been increased to $111 billion. $67 billion is going to go to Ukraine, $14 billion for Israel. I think over $10 billion for border security. That's, to hire more judges for immigration courts, to hire more ICE agents for border apprehensions. I didn't go down the whole list of what all the border money is. And then also money for the military buildup in the Asia Pacific. Some of that money will go to Taiwan. I believe it's in the form of foreign military financing. So we will purchase American weapons for the Taiwanese with that money. But I believe some of that money also goes to, building military assets on Guam and Japan and South Korea, all over the Asia Pacific. So this is, really a world war bill is what we're talking about here. This is so the U.S. could fight a war in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia against Russia, against, who knows in the Middle East, essentially everybody who doesn't follow the American dictates on what is supposed to happen in that region. So, that would be Iran, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Shia militias of Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. And so this is, this is a huge bill. And then, of course, China in the Asia Pacific. So back to Dave DeCamp's article here about the actual failure that just occurred. The effort failed on a vote of 49-51, with every Republican voting against the measure. Senator Bernie Sanders, the independent from Vermont, also voted no. I wonder how many times Bernie Sanders has ever voted only with the Republicans. That would be an interesting little stat there. Due to his opposition to providing Israel with more unconditional military aid as it's killing civilians on a massive scale. So that's a really strong vote for Bernie. And I don't like the guy and have made it clear that I think he is essentially a fraud who often goes along with the war state and just, panders about being this independent with new ideas and new thoughts. And really, he just doesn't have any moral courage at all. But this, shows that is not always true. This is a big vote for Bernie Sanders, especially because So many people identify him with his Jewish heritage. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer switched his vote to no when he realized the bill wouldn't receive the 60 votes needed, so he could bring the vote to the floor again in the future. So, I guess that is. Just a tactical maneuver. President Biden initially requested $106 billion for the spending package, but Senate Democrats increased the number to $111 billion. The package includes a whopping $67 billion for Ukraine to fuel the war and prop up the Ukrainian government for another entire year, despite clear signs that the Ukrainian forces cannot break through the Russian defenses. The $111 billion bill also plans to beef up security at the border. Republicans are looking to change asylum laws to make it more difficult for migrants to enter the country. Schumer called the vote despite the lack of a deal, and the bill was expected to fail. Earlier in the day, President Biden pleaded with Congress to pass more funding for the Ukraine war, claiming if U.S. aid dried up, Russia would invade NATO territory in Europe. Then we will have something we don't seek, and that is what we don't have today: American troops fighting against Russian troops. And so, what a lie that is. Of course, the US is in its most, hostile and close to confrontation with Russia over the proxy war that we're fighting against Russia and Ukraine. Russia doesn't have its eye on other pieces in NATO. They just really just wanted Ukrainian neutrality, and when the US and its Western allies refused to allow that, Russia went to war to take territory from Ukraine in order to give it that buffer zone that Moscow was looking for. And then, here we have another real issue with just the American political system, which is if you're trying to pass a piece, some kind of law, right? So the Republicans want to change asylum law. Rather than that law being particularly debated, it's always, these important issues are made really side issues, and they've collected like 10 side issues together and say, oh, all these side issues together are so important, and everybody supports one of these side issues, and so they package them all together and then they try to force them through in one thing. And so you have aid to Israel, aid to Ukraine, aid to Taiwan, aid, and all these other Asian Pacific nations. And then you have not only funding for the border, but actual border policy being discussed here. And so what they try to do is make it so that somebody supports at least everything, one piece of this bill. And they hope that forces everybody to essentially vote for it, right? Because if you're, claim you're a super strong supporter of Israel or Ukraine, you don't want your opposition candidate come the next election to be, saying that, oh, he voted against Ukraine funding all these times. Well, that congressman may not have been voting against Ukraine funding. He may have been voting against Israel funding or something else, but these are the way American attack ads and politics tend to work, and so it's just, this is just an example of why there is so much dysfunction. And unfortunately, I really do believe the Ukraine aid is going to get passed. I know we're just a couple weeks away here from the Ukrainians, or the White House actually running out of money to send weapons to Ukraine, which that would be great. Now, look, from the perspective of making sure the Ukrainians get to keep as much of their country as possible and have as much leverage as possible, I certainly hope that if the White House really doesn't believe that they could pass another massive aid bill, then not only are they now talking to the Ukrainians, but for the past few weeks, they've really been talking to the Ukrainians saying like, hey, you may want to consider negotiating while you still have some of our weapons to fight with, because those are going to dry up in the next few months. And once they do, you're going to be at an even greater disadvantage. So that is something that, should really be telegraphed to the Ukrainians so they understand their situation and can negotiate as good as a deal possible for themselves. But at the same time, the U.S. shouldn't give Ukraine more aid or time to do that. That's just something that we should have explained. Now, the real problem here for the White House, for Zelensky, for Ukraine in general, is that it's very obvious that Ukraine could have gotten a better deal within a couple months of the start of the war, and certainly one before the war even started. The West could have negotiated Ukrainian neutrality, said, yes, we'll close the door to NATO. No, we're not going to expand NATO further eastward that we already have. Georgia, Ukraine are not going to become members of NATO. So, don't worry about that, Russia. And then, maybe Russia doesn't invade Ukraine at all. And because they had that assurance of neutrality. And, this has been made clear by the Ukrainian negotiating team when they said that all the other things that Russia was talking about, the denazification of Ukraine, demilitarization, really all they wanted was the neutrality. And so Russia would give Ukraine back all the territory except the Crimean Peninsula in the early months of the war, save the lives of at least tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, and, negotiate an end to the war and keep, the Donbass, Kherson, Zaporizhia, all Ukrainian provinces. All Ukraine had to do was agree to neutrality and refuse to do it in March of 2022 because of what the West was telling them. And so now when they negotiate, they will. I don't see any path where Ukraine is going to be able to, get Russia to relinquish these 4 regions of Ukraine that they've already annexed, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk, and that those two, the last two, make up the Donbass, of course. Those will not be going back to Ukraine now. And so not only is Ukraine going to have lost a lot of lives, infrastructure, their economy will be in shambles. Of course, pre-war, a lot of the Ukrainian economy and a lot of the Ukrainian investment really did come from Russia. So that'll be probably turned off, for the foreseeable future now. So that's, another issue that the Ukrainians will have to look at. All these things, I think really show how poor of a deal and how bad of a decision it was in the early days of the war for the Ukrainians to decide to continue fighting rather than negotiating a deal then. All right, so next up here, U.S. looks to help Ukraine increase its own weapons production. Ukrainian officials traveled to Washington this week to attend a conference on building up Ukraine's own military-industrial complex to reduce its reliance on Western weapons for military equipment. Opening the conference on Wednesday, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said the U.S. and its allies would currently strengthen Ukraine's defense base both to maintain Ukraine's current war effort and to bolster Ukraine's national strength and deterrence into the long-term future. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told Reuters that Ukraine becoming more self-sufficient in weapons production obviously alleviates the long-term need for continued supply of weapons from the U.S. and other Western countries. So, the logistics of doing this during wartime seem absolutely unrealistic. I'm not sure how many air defense interceptors the U.S. can really provide to Ukraine over the long term, but I have to imagine that Russia would focus its targeting of its long-range missiles, its hypersonic missiles, all the very expendable and cheap suicide drones that Russia has and that Russia uses. Would be able to disable these targets, to be able to actually have a factory and produce artillery shells at a decent supply. I would, assume that even small damage to the building, the infrastructure, getting trucks in, out, supplies in, out, the fact that they're making ammunition there, so hitting any kind of, stores of, whatever explosive you're using in the warheads and blasting caps and stuff like that are all going to be major issues. So I'm not sure how the U.S. actually intends to logistically make this happen. My guess is that there could be a couple of other things behind this. One is just corruption. And so, pouring money into Ukraine for things that will get destroyed probably makes it very easy to launder and steal a lot of that money anyways. And then also it just looks good from the American perspective and from the Ukraine perspective. It makes good propaganda. But the reality that, they're going to start producing 155 millimeter shells in Ukraine just seems unreal to me at this point. And again, maybe if the war stops, that's something that could happen, but as is. Now, those officials are also in the U.S., and there's also European officials in the U.S. who are lobbying Washington right now to pass that big aid bill for Ukraine. And I know it sounds kind of stupid, but I do think these things where, congressmen talk to some Ukrainian They'll bring some soldiers, some injured vets, some higher ranking officials, and they'll really be moved by what these people say. And so I do think that is a potential thing that could move the needle in Congress. Now, Ukraine does seem to be at least doing a few things with its industrial base. Forbes reported this week that Ukraine had developed a new variant of its Neptune anti-ship missile. These are supposed to be long-range cruise missiles. I'm not sure how often they've been deployed through this conflict and to what extent. I am pretty sure that even if something is a um an anti-ship missile, they can't fire it against a land-to-land target too. I'm just not sure how different the calculations are, and it may not be as accurate or as effective, depending on how the warhead is designed, specifically for a ship or something like that. But they do claim to now have an extended version of their Neptune cruise missile. And the Forbes didn't report on a number of miles. I think the current Neptune missile has a range of about 200 miles. It didn't say what the range of the new missile would be, but said it would be a significant increase. I have no idea what a significant increase would be, if that's 50 miles, if that's 500 miles, if that's 2,000 miles. So lots of questions here. And of course, how many Ukraine could actually make. And also interesting would be what role the U.S. is playing in helping, or other Western countries are helping Ukraine to design these arms. All right, next up here, U.S. announces $175 million in weapons for Ukraine as Biden pleads for more funding. The Biden administration on Wednesday announced a new $175 million weapons package for Ukraine as President Biden pleads with Congress to authorize more spending for the proxy war. This cannot wait, Biden said in a televised statement. Congress needs to pass this supplemental funding for Ukraine before they break for the holiday recess. Simple as that. Frankly, I think it's stunning that we haven't gotten to this point in the first place. Republicans in Congress are willing to give Putin the greatest gift he can hope for and abandon our global leadership. The president claimed that if the U.S. doesn't support Ukraine, Russia could attack a NATO ally, and I already said that, this is absolutely ridiculous. Later in the day, the Senate voted on the massive bill, and it didn't pass because of Republican issues over the border. And so, this is kind of the Biden policy blowing up in his face, right? It was the president that decided that the border bill needed to be stuffed into the same package as the Ukraine bill, thinking that that would help him to get it to pass. And now that Republicans are kind of doing what Congress should do, right? Which is debate a bill and all the aspects of it, and, try to change and alter laws and things like that, that the White House is now saying, oh, we don't have time for that because we need to pass this Ukraine aid. Well, if you need to pass one thing at a time, that's more the way that Congress should work. The reason Congress doesn't want to do that, of course, is because the Ukraine aid is unpopular among a lot of Americans. A lot of Americans don't want to send another $60 billion in weapons to Ukraine, only to see the Ukrainians lose, tens of thousands of more men, miles and miles more regions of Ukraine, and then have to suffer a worse agreement with Russia at the end of the war anyway. So the new package is from the Presidential Drawdown Authority, and it is funds made available through the Pentagon accounting error. Talked about that a lot, so I'm not going to get into it here. Just want to quickly go through and let everybody know what is in this. So, air defense interceptors, and those are AIM-9M and AIM-7 missiles for as far as the interceptors. Additional ammunition for HIMARS, 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds. They do not specify ever if those are cluster or conventional warheads on those artillery rounds. I kind of assume that they're mostly cluster, but one package may be, 3 packages may be cluster, and then one would be conventional, just based on the rate that the U.S. could produce them, is what I'm guessing there. So HARM missiles, TOW missiles, Javelin and AT-4 anti-armor systems, 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition, vehicles to tow and haul equipment, demolition munitions for obstacle clearing, equipment to protect critical national infrastructure. I have no idea what that could be. Mostly I would assume those are air defense interceptors, so I would be interested to know what that is. And then spare parts, maintenance, and other ancillary equipment. And of course, anything could be included in the ancillary equipment as well. So we just have to uh, hope that if anything major is going to Ukraine, there's some kind of leak or something like that. All right, next up here, U.S. granted access to Sweden's military bases by new defense pact. The U.S. and Sweden have signed a new defense cooperation agreement. Those are called DCAs that will grant the U.S. military access to bases across the Nordic country as Stockholm abandons its centuries-old policy of neutrality. The Pentagon said the deal will allow U.S. forces to operate in Sweden, including the legal status of U.S. military personnel, access to deployment areas, and prepositioning of military material. Sweden's defense minister inked the pact with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin on Tuesday and said it will create better conditions for Sweden to be able to receive support from the United States in the event of a war crisis. The deal comes as Sweden is waiting for Turkey and Hungary to approve its NATO bid. The U.S. State Department said the DCA with Sweden will apply seamlessly before and after Sweden's ascension into NATO's Status of Forces Agreement. Sweden and Finland applied to join NATO together last year, but Turkey delayed the process over allegations that the Nordic countries support the PKK, a Kurdish militant group that Ankara, the EU, and the US consider to be terrorist organizations. But at the same time, the US and a lot of the European Union have supported an offshoot of the PKK, that's the Syrian Kurdish YPG, in the fight against ISIS. And I think there's been a lot of free flowing of weapons and personnel across the border and a lot of common cause between the Syrian and the Turkish Kurdish groups. So Turkey's main gripes are with Sweden, and the Turkish parliament's approved Helsinki's bid earlier this year while delaying Stockholm's membership. And again, Turkey and Hungary are kind of not ratifying the Swedish NATO bid. As with Finland, I expect that Hungary is essentially just they don't want to approve the NATO bid until they know it's actually for sure going to go through. And so once Turkey approves, then Hungary will. But if Turkey delays, then Hungary will continue to delay as well. The Turkish president, Erdogan, said on Wednesday that he expects the U.S. to move forward on a major F-16 sale before his parliament ratifies Sweden's membership. The deal has support from the Biden administration, but there are some opposition in Congress. And we see this all the time, right? Where the U.S. uses weapon sales as essentially the closest thing that we have to diplomacy. If we want another country to do something, we say, hey, you want some weapons? You want some weapons? Do this for us first. All right. So now on to move about the situation in Gaza. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. White House says no deadline for Israel to end Gaza onslaught. And, basically what you're going to get here is that even though this has, I think we're at the point where it's time to probably start using the word genocide to describe what Israel is doing in Gaza. And I know there's been people who have been saying it a lot. And if you use just the strict definition of genocide, then it probably fit pretty early in the Israeli military campaign of what they were doing in Gaza. I think the way at least Americans look at it, the word which is trying to eliminate a group of people, when you look at what's happening now, it's pretty close to just a full-on, we want all the Palestinians that live in Gaza dead policy from the Israelis here. And the White House just has nothing to say about it. They'll say, we want them to reduce civilian casualties, but the policy is unwavering support for Israel, even as this has become fairly transparent. So, U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner said Thursday that the Biden administration has not set a deadline on Israel's war in Gaza and reiterated U.S. opposition to a ceasefire. We have not given a firm deadline to Israel, not really our role. This is their conflict. That said, we do have influence, even if we didn't have ultimate control over what happens on the ground in Gaza. And he said this to the Aspen Security Forums. Now, I think a lot of what he's saying there is untrue. I think if the U.S. wanted to force Israel to stop what they're doing in Gaza, they probably could. In in a week, maybe not, but in over the course of probably a week or so, I would imagine with political pressure. I mean, if Biden comes out and says, if Israel keeps doing this, we're going to deem it a genocide and cut off all aid for Israel forever, they may stop within an hour. If the Biden administration privately communicates to them that they will not receive any more weapons so long as this military confrontation is happening, I could see the Israelis carrying on for maybe another week or so, but ultimately relenting, understanding that they are very reliant on the U.S. military industrial complex, and a lot of their weapons are American weapon systems, and is threatening to shut off, the massive amount of aid that we give to Israel would probably be enough to rein in Netanyahu over a fairly short term. But the U.S. is making it clear, the White House is making it clear that they have no interest in that whatsoever. So the Financial Times reported last week that the Israeli onslaught is now expected to last over a year. U.S. officials told CNN that they expect the current phase of the war, which involves constant airstrikes and a ground operation, to continue well into 2024, and then the Israeli would narrow down its targeting to specific Hamas members, possibly by January. Feiner said the U.S. supports Israel's goal of ensuring that Hamas can no longer govern, although Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly stated his objective is eliminating Hamas altogether. Feiner said the U.S. is not in a place yet of asking Israel to stop or for a ceasefire. There is no indication that Israel is successfully taking out Hamas members. Its bombardment has incurred a massive civilian death toll. The Gaza Health Ministry said on Thursday that 17,177 Palestinians have been killed since Israel unleashed its campaign on Gaza on October 8th, and about 70% of the dead are women and children. And of course, the number of children dead, I believe, has now crossed an estimated 7,000, and the number of dead Hamas members is 1 to 2,000 is, the reports that we got from Israel. Another Israeli official says as high as 5,000, but still Israel is killing probably 1 to 7 Palestinian children for every member of Hamas they killed, which again, I think really goes to, support the whole genocide statement there. Now, let's move on and talk about this joint investigation that finds Israeli tank shell killed journalist in Lebanon. A joint investigation by Reuters, AFP, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International found on October 13th an Israeli tank conducted a lethal attack on journalists in southern Lebanon. Since October 7th, the Israeli military operations have killed and wounded scores of journalists across Lebanon, the West Bank, and Gaza. The investigators concluded that the Israeli tank shell killed a group of easily identified journalists. Reuters videographer Issam Abdallah was murdered. Agency France Press photographer Christina Ossi was severely injured, and then other journalists from Reuters, AFP, and Al Jazeera were also wounded. Dylan Collins, he is an AFP videographer who was with Abdallah when he was killed, said, "We felt safe, we felt secure, so we got to work. 7 journalists, all of us wearing flak jackets and helmets, everyone clearly marked as a member of press. The Israelis knew we were there from the moment we arrived." AFP said in a report that the strikes were deliberate and targeted, coming close together in time and space, hitting journalists who were clearly identified as press away from any military activity. A researcher for Human Rights Watch said that the evidence reveals that the Israeli army knew or should have known that the people they were firing on were civilians and journalists. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International called the attack a war crime. Reuters editor-in-chief condemned the killing in a statement and called on Israel to explain how this could have happened and to hold to account those responsible. Now, when this happened, remember, this is a Reuters photojournalist who was killed, our videographer who was killed. Reuters' initial statement on this is, we want to know what happened. We don't know what happened. And when it was pretty obvious from the start that this was the Israelis. And so I don't think my story here that I wrote for the Institute, by the way, is in any way breaking news. I just think this is, important that we had this independent investigation from these 4 mainstream Western sources that unequivocally, condemn this as a war crime, say it was intentional, say the journalists were clearly labeled as journalists, and Israel chose to murder them anyways. And Reuters is, the one of the 4 that kind of gives the limpest statement to all this. So the lethal attacks by the IDF against journalists are not uncommon. In May, I think this is 2021. I think I got the wrong date here, so apologize for that, and I'll fix it when after I record this show. Shireen Abu Akleh was murdered by an Israeli sniper in the West Bank. Abu Akleh was with a group of other journalists and wearing unrecognizable press equipment. The Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, report found that at least 13 of 20 journalists who were killed by Israeli forces between 2001 and 2023 were clearly identified members of the media or were inside vehicles with press insignia at the time of their deaths. So this shows a clear pattern of Israeli forces intentionally targeting journalists. More recently, the Israeli military operations in Gaza have killed dozens of journalists. Since October 7th, 56 Palestinians and 3 Lebanese journalists had been killed. 4 Israeli journalists were killed during the Hamas attack on October 7th. Additionally, 11 journalists have been wounded, 3 are missing, and 19 have been arrested. Human rights groups are warning about the high death toll among journalists. Anthony Bellinger, the general secretary for the International Federation of Journalists, told the Associated Press on Friday that the killing of journalists in Gaza is unlike what has happened in other war zones. In a war, a classical war, I could say that in Syria, Iraq, and ex-Yugoslavia, we didn't see this kind of massacre. CPJ said the war in Gaza has produced the deadliest month for journalists since the group began keeping count. A statement from the group said the Israel-Gaza war has taken a severe toll on journalists, which has led to the deadliest months for journalists since CPJ began collecting data in 1992. So that's over 3 decades of collecting data in war zones all across the world. And we're talking about, the worst months of Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine, wars in Africa like Somalia, Ethiopia. And they're saying, no, what Israel is doing to journalists is worse than all of that. And then Reporters Without Borders warned that journalism was being eradicated in Gaza. The group said journalism is in the process of being eradicated in the Gaza Strip as the result of Israel's refusal to heed the call to protect military personnel. And so again, all these very mainstream Western organizations are coming out and screaming about what Israel is doing in Gaza and it just intentionally killing journalists. It seems pretty clear at this point. All right, next up here, White House interns call Israeli actions in Gaza a genocide and demand Biden call for a ceasefire. Now, so this is a group of more than 40 interns at the White House, and they assigned a letter demanding that Joe Biden call for a permanent ceasefire. The interns behind the letter, White House Interns for Palestine, said the Biden had to reverse course in supporting Israel. Now, look, these are just interns, right? So, and I get it, that this may not sound like the most important story. However, my guess is almost every intern in the White House has a well-connected relative. Everybody in the White House is some senator, some deputy secretary of states, some general's nephew, son, daughter. I mean, this is who makes up. These are all people who are well connected. And so them having this belief, because in their letter, they call what is happening in Gaza a genocide. And so people working in the White House feel that way. Now, I do imagine too that there are probably hundreds, if not close to 1,000 people who could call themselves White House interns. I'm not sure at all if the interns who signed this letter are maybe a closer collection to those around the president or something like that. I'm sure there are specific interns who do stuff around the Oval Office versus I'm not sure if maybe the intern who helps out in the kitchen gets to call themselves a White House intern. But I'm sure there's a lot of jobs. So I'm not saying that these are all really important people surrounding the president who have, other people who surround the president, but I think it's probably hopeful, especially in the long run too, when you consider that these are well-connected people who will probably be in positions of power in years to come. So the letter shared with Middle East Eye says that the signers can no longer remain silent on the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people. We urge the Biden-Harris administration to call for a permanent ceasefire now, a release of all hostages, including Palestinian political prisoners, and to support the diplomatic solution that will put an end to the illegal occupation and the Israeli apartheid in accordance with international law and for a free Palestine. After the Hamas attack on October 7th, Israel has been conducting a brutal military campaign in Gaza, killing over 15,000 people, now over 17,000 people, and over 7,000 children. Some of the most devastating attacks on civilians have been committed with American-made bombs. White House officials have asked Tel Aviv to try to curb civilian casualties in some public statements. However, the administration is refusing to condition the weapons it sends to Israel on reducing civilian casualties or reaching a ceasefire. Since Tel Aviv started bombing Gaza, the U.S. has sent arms to Israel every day, including over 15,000 bombs. U.S. officials speaking with CNN say Israel has ignored requests from the U.S. And so this is a quote from the CNN report. Though senior Biden administration officials have publicly called on Israel to do more to minimize civilian deaths, they have been careful to avoid directly admonishing any of Israel's tactics. Officials believe it's more effective to quietly counsel Israel behind the scenes rather than loudly shame them. The senior administration official told CNN that they did not feel comfortable using the word receptive to capture Israel's response so far to the administration's military advice, contrary to some public statements from senior members of the administration. So they're talking about probably Antony Blinken there when, he goes and he says, Israel says they're going to reduce civilian casualties. We talked with them about this. What's, the officials speaking with CNN are saying are that Israel is not receptive to that at all. And they're telling, giving Blinken a middle finger and just going about slaughtering Palestinians as they want, knowing full well the Biden administration is not willing to roll back their military support for Tel Aviv. So the White House interns for Palestine are urging the administration to shift away from supporting Tel Aviv. The letter says, we are urging the administration to change course. In our limited capacity, we are having these conversations and bringing the will of the American people to the halls of the highest office. We will not stop trying. The ongoing violence perpetuated by the Israeli government, as well as the ongoing dehumanizing rhetoric targeting Muslims and Arabs, has promoted a wave of massive violence and tragedies. All right, next up here. This one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S. not considering leveraging aid to Israel to limit civilian casualties. So despite the soaring civilian death toll, the Biden administration is not considering using any of the leverage it has over Israel to get the Israeli military to change its tactics, Reuters reported on Tuesday. U.S. officials say they are expressing concern privately and claim Israel is listening, but the current campaign in South Gaza, where there are millions of displaced civilians, is no less brutal than what Israel did in the north. The U.S. has pointed to Israel allowing more aid trucks into Gaza as proof that Israel is listening, but the UN's top relief official Martin Griffiths has said that the situation in South Gaza is apocalyptic and ending any possibility of meaningful humanitarian operations. Gaza's health ministry has said that nearly 16,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since October 7th, 70% being women and children. The mass slaughter of civilians has not caused the Biden administration to rethink support for the war, and the Reuters report said the U.S. is stopping well short of measures that would force Israel to listen to concerns about civilian casualties, such as restricting military aid. Instead, U.S. officials have maintained U.S. military aid to Israel is unconditional. The support has involved near daily weapon shipments, including thousands of massive bombs, and the deployment of more American firepower in the region to deter regional actors from entering the war. When U.S. officials claimed to Reuters that reducing military support for the onslaught would carry risk, you start lessening aid to Israel and start encouraging other parties to come to the conflict. You weaken the deterrence effect and you encourage Israel's other enemies. I'm not sure where he gets that from, because every group in the region who's been attacking Israel are Israeli assets. The Houthis, Hezbollah, the Shia militias of Iraq and Syria, importantly and distinctly not Iran. They have not, and from what I've seen, are not even like actively encouraging these attacks to happen. And these groups all say that if it stops in Gaza, we will stop our attacks. And as proof of this, when the ceasefire happened, all these groups knocked it off. I think there was one rocket attack on U.S. bases in Iraq or Syria, and then the Houthis launched an attack as well, but that was all. So Israeli officials have made clear that they aren't feeling any pressure to change their tactics. A foreign policy advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, "I must admit, I sense the Prime Minister feels zero pressure, and we will do whatever it takes to achieve our military goals." And so that's pretty telling that we give Israel billions of dollars in military aid. The White House wants to give them additional $14 billion in military aid, and they're actively being ignored by the Israelis. All right, UN Security Council to discuss Gaza after UN chief votes rare rule. The UN Security Council is expected to meet on Friday to discuss the Israeli onslaught in Gaza after UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter for the first time during his tenure, which started in 2017. Article 99 allows the UN chief to bring a matter of attention to the UN Security Council that he believes threatens international peace and stability. While invoking the rule, Guterres repeated his call for a humanitarian ceasefire. The Biden administration has rejected the idea of a ceasefire and blocked a UN Security Council resolution calling for one back in October. The U.S., which holds veto power as a permanent member of the 15-nation council, eventually allowed a resolution to pass that called for humanitarian pauses. Guterres and other UN officials have said Israel renewed its onslaught has made relief efforts impossible. More aid trucks have been allowed into Gaza during the weeks-long truce that enabled hostage releases, but the current Israeli operations have halted most aid deliveries. And think about it this way, the people of Gaza did require quite a substantial amount of aid because of, the occupation of Israel over the Gaza Strip before October 7th. But now the Strip has been absolutely decimated. Over 100,000 buildings damaged or destroyed. And this includes important targets: bakeries, banks, universities, hospitals, residential homes, schools, UN shelters. And so now they have over 1 million Gazans living in UN shelters where they can't even provide people with enough food and water in those shelters already. And so prior to the invasion of Gaza, there were 500 trucks going into Gaza every day with aid. During the ceasefire, that only reached 200 at most. And so I think that's kind of telling in that, even before, that wouldn't have been enough to sustain Gaza. When now more people are relying on aid, it's an absolute drop in the bucket. So, despite what the U.S. says, nothing Israel or the U.S. is doing is helping the Palestinians in any way. So Egypt warns driving Palestinians into Sinai will rupture ties. According to Barak Ravid, who writes in Axios, Egypt warned the U.S. and Israel that if Palestinian refugees flee into the Sinai as a result of the Israeli military operations in southern Gaza, it could create a rupture in relations between Egypt and Israel, according to 4 U.S. and Israeli officials. And in the past, Egypt has says that they will go to war over this. Israel has destroyed most of northern Gaza. The 2.3 million Palestinians that live in Gaza have been mostly driven into overcrowded shelters in southern Gaza. Israel is expanding its military operations in southern Gaza now, killing more civilians and driving Palestinians into smaller and smaller areas. All right, last up here. Quick article on Yemen. U.S. tells Israel not to strike Houthi in Yemen. So the Biden administration asked Israel not to respond to recent attacks by Yemen's Houthis, the Wall Street Journal report on Thursday. The Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, have fired missiles and drones at Israel in response to the Israeli onslaught in Gaza and have targeted Israeli-linked commercial ships in the Red Sea. U.S. warships have responded to the Houthi attacks and have downed several Houthi missiles and drones in recent weeks. According to the journal, the U.S. is concerned that an Israeli response could spark a major regional war. U.S. officials told Israel that the U.S. would handle any potential response, although Politico report that the administration was not planning on directly targeting the Houthis for now. Politico reported that the Pentagon has drawn up plans to strike the Houthis, but they have not presented or recommended to President Biden. The report said that the highest level consensus within the administration is that it does not make sense for the U.S. military to respond directly to the Houthis. Saudi Arabia has also urged the U.S. not to strike the Houthis over concerns that an attack could jeopardize the Saudi Houthi peace process. A ceasefire between the Houthis and the Saudis has been holding relatively well since April of 2022, but a lasting peace deal has not been signed. The U.S. announced sanctions targeting the Houthi on Thursday that put 13 people and firms allegedly involved with the shipment and sale of Iranian commodities to Yemen on blacklist. The Treasury Department claims that the network transferred tens of millions of dollars worth of foreign currency to the Houthis. The U.S. has backed a Saudi-led coalition against the Houthis since 2015 in a brutal war that has killed at least 400,000 people, but it's rare that the U.S. and the Houthis engage in directly exchange fire. I think it happened once in 2016. The Houthis had developed some new anti-ship rockets and they fired them at U.S. ships. I'm not sure one even ever landed within a nautical mile of a U.S. ship, but still the U.S. conducted some strikes against Houthi radar targets, or that's what they claimed they were, in 2016 in what they said was retaliation. All right, that'll wrap up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you still are listening, head on over to the Libertarian Institute, make a donation. We'll be back with more shows next week.